On June 24, 2014, Panini America announced the return of the Dragon Ball Z collectible card game. It was spearheaded by Ekton Thuradal, winner of the first World Championship of the Score Dragon Ball Z card game, in which the Panini version was based upon. Many prominent players from the Score Games community were recruited to playtest the game, including Garrett Wilkinson, Joey DiCarlo, David Fassbinder, and Nick Glazer, all of whom had competitive success during the lifespan of the Score game. Names like Joshua Morris, Garrett Wilkinson, and the others who ran the Retro DBZ community online had continued to develop cards for the Score game under the guise of Retro DBZ, a virtual online format which players would print out cards or proxy online through tabletop programs to continue playing the Score game. This indicated that there was still immense interest in the IP. It was through this internet culture that the new Panini game would look upon for its initial fan base, promising a game that would be much like the Score game, albeit with some caveats. New keywords brought in, such as critical damage effects and rejuvenation, aimed to streamline gameplay and text. A few other changes between Score and Panini versions included main personality sets, a character which the player would choose for deck construction, always containing levels 1 through 4. Mastery cards becoming mandatory for deck construction, ensuring every deck in the game had to be a singular color or style of card, though decks could include any number of colorless or non-styled cards. Deck construction being no more or less than 60 cards, the locking of name cards, cards which had a character's name in the title, to only be usable by said character. A month later, on July 24th, at the Panini Games booth at San Diego Comic-Con, a promo card for the new Dragon Ball Z card game was revealed, as a tie-in for the up-and-coming movie Dragon Ball Z Battle of the Gods. This promo featured a Super Saiyan God Goku card, which quickly rose in price, creating one of the game's early tactics of market manipulation through a secondary market. Riding on the wave of a renaissance of DBZ-related interest in popular culture, the numbers of members on the popular Retro DBZ CCG Facebook group swelled with the influx of new and returning players from the Score era. Slated for an October 17th release, Panini America and affiliated fan sites such as DBZ Fanatics, Top Tier DBZ, and Retro DBZ CCG would release spoilers for the first set, deemed premiere. Much anticipation was garnered by a very passionate and loyal fan base of players, which had continued to organize events across the country at conventions and game stores for years. Some questions began as players debated how the game should tackle the blocking of sets. In the old Score game, the English dub of Dragon Ball Z was simultaneously released with the card game, causing the game to release sequentially with the story. Without that as a guideline, would the Panini game do the same, or would it aim to tackle the story as a whole? Should the game have been released as a living card game, easing the burden on cost on players? A bigger controversy arose when popular staples of the Score game, Trunks Energy Sphere, was split up into two ultra-rare cards, Villainous and Heroic Energy Sphere, putting a greater strain on casual players who wish to access a powerful countercard. Gradually, as more cards were previewed, demo decks were released for players to try out. The pairings of main personalities to masteries in these demo decks would translate to the pairings a player would receive when purchasing a starter deck. Now, these included Orange Adaptive Mastery with Goku, Black Devious Mastery and Krillin, Blue Protective Mastery and Frieza, Red Enraged Mastery and Gohan, Namekian Knowledge Mastery and Piccolo, and Saiyan Empowered Mastery with Vegeta. With the exception of Namekian and Saiyan Masteries, which were locked to main personalities of those races only, any main personality, or MP, could be paired with any mastery of the player's choice. Additionally, Captain Ginyu and Future Trunks were released in packs as additional playable personalities, with Ginyu in all styles becoming one of the strongest decks to play for the next few sets of the game. As players began to test the demo decks on their countertops, or on the popular tabletop program OCTGN, also known as Octagon, strategies and theory crafting began to form. What decks would players gravitate towards? My name is Frank DeLuca. I had played the Score game very casually during its run in the years of 2003 through 2006. I never played in any tournaments, and I never had a lot of cards. My favorite MP was a Majin Vegeta starter set that I'd gotten off of eBay after begging my dad to buy it for me as a reward for getting good grades. I fast forward to 2012. My favorite character in Dragon Ball Z is Future Gohan, and as a teenager in high school, I was searching Google images for pictures of Future Gohan and stumbled upon Retro DBZ CCG. It was a website that was run by Joshua Morris and Garrett Wilkinson, two gentlemen who had worked on the original Score game. They and others such as Jeffrey Brewster had continued to release cards to be compatible with the Score game. Now, I was elated to see that they made cards for Future Gohan that were competitive, and some YouTube channels such as Random Number Gaming, which is run by Didier Greenleaf, covered events and matches for the Retro DBZ format. I began to read articles posted by players such as David Fassbinder, David Eckert, or Chippy, Kevin Bach, and Scott Dashy on the Retro DBZ CCG website and their Facebook group. I learned a lot about the meta and decks. Began to play a lot of low-tier decks on Octagon, with a personal favorite of mine being one that utilized Goku's farewell to reach the level 4 of Videl that the retro DBZ gang had made. I played around a whole archetype of cards called the heroic cards, which focused on punishing opponents for being villains or Majins, which Videl made more consistent by making them considered always a villain or Majin. It was something that was never really viable until Videl in the virtual format, so I really enjoyed the design of the cards in the format, so it got me hooked. I really liked Future Gohan and Videl as my favorite characters, and I would play pretty regularly on Octagon for a couple of years or so, about a year and a half at least, as I kind of rounded up high school. In 2014, I graduated high school, and I had a heavy bout of depression and anxiety that just kind of swept over me and loomed in my life until my mid-20s. So when I saw the announcement of the Panini game, I was overjoyed. I downloaded the demo decks, and I played them online with people. I really wanted to play Gohan, and so even though he was arguably the worst character, I mained him and Vegeta quite a bit. I tried all the different masteries. I was just a huge fan of DBZ Bridge, so when I got to see the card art of Devastating Blow, I laughed my ass off. It was one of my favorite scenes, and something I quoted with my friends all the time, which is probably partially why I love Devastating Blow, and it's one of my favorite cards. It's still up there with Tug of War, but we're going to have to wait a little bit till we see that card, and in a relevant way for this series, but I got connected deeper to the game than it just being game. I got to see familiar names on YouTube and online hop in Octagon and play with me. I watched videos about the new game. I watched all this stuff and read everything about how people felt about the game, and I would regularly comb through the Facebook group for information. It was just something I could pour my heart into because I loved Dragon Ball Z. I got to play the card game physically again. So as October 17th starts to come around, which ends up being the release date for the Panini game, I had begun college that year. I'd adventured to a local game store I'd never been to before, called Dungeons End, which is no longer existing, unfortunately. COVID really killed them, but I talked with the owners, and I asked if I could organize events and if they would get product in, for us to play with and sell. And so I got people together, and it turned out there was some other people that were interested in it and had asked, and so they got us together. I made a little Facebook group for our local group. I made really easy crappy flyers on the printer at school, and I brought them and posted them around where I could, and put my phone number on them, tried to get people to come join, put the Facebook group on, and we never probably had more than a dozen people in our local group, but it was a lot of fun. I was really into it, and God, I feel like I mostly just played like Saiyan Vegeta at these events. I'm sure I probably played some other stuff. I played like Red and Rage Krillin one of the times. That was pretty fun. That's a deck that I will definitely cover at some point here. Just a bunch of random stuff, and I even went online and looked for the store locator to try to find places. I saw that Dan Green out in Paradox, I believe Paradox Games out in Fargo was like the only person that was like really hosting events and doing bigger stuff. So I thought about driving across the state to go to Fargo to play. I even messaged him and stuff. I just became part of the Popos group. I would trade out my foils that I would get and some of my really good rares to try to trade for more confrontations and stare downs and all sorts of other stuff. Even trading for like regular copies of Visiting the Past because I was a college kid that, probably should have not been spending his money on cards. The game came out in a time that was really tough for me. I was really struggling to find my way as a young adult, and I was able to find a sense of community pretty quickly through it. The game has meant a lot to me. I was really privileged that I got to grow up and have a lot of people around that were at least good members of the community that I could talk to, especially the retro days, that kind of guided me when I was playing. And I did my best to try to make friends when I went out to events. I met my friend Mike Teagues at like the first North Kai event for Panini that they did, and a bunch of other people from the Wisconsin Kenosha crew that I got to keep with. I got to like meet Didier in person. That was super cool because Didier was like this personality that was doing YouTube videos. I had a ton of fun, and that stuff's kind of a little bit more for the future here, but I wanted to go through the sets of Panini and kind of talk about the decks, things going on at the time, kind of as like a historical telling. And I plan to kind of reach out to some of the people that I know were kind of, I don't want to say relevant at the time, but kind of had some of the more memorable moments perhaps. And I hope maybe that like as people watch through this whole thing, that maybe that brings back some memories and things that they can comment on and share, because the community of this game is what has kept me definitely around more than anything. I've been, like I said, it's been a real honor to like meet a lot of people. Most of the people are actually pretty awesome. Sure, with some exceptions, but that's everything. But this is a kind of a passion project and something I've wanted to do for a long time, inspired by the series History of Yu-Gi-Oh! That YouTubers Simo and MBT do. That was really, I thought, really interesting and fun, and a nice way to kind of positively reflect on the Panini game, kind of leading us up to the modern era of Fantasy. So we are nearing the 10th, anniversary of the game being released, and getting pretty close to like the 8th year after cancellation, sadly enough. But I hope you guys enjoy here. If you have any comments or feedback for me, by all means. But I'd like to hop into things here as we go through the different decks and things and the metas and stuff here. So here we have it. We have some of the MPs and the Masteries and some interesting cards and some little tidbits from the first set here. So a lot of these Masters, I haven't loaded these up in Octagon in a long time. But of course we have the 6 MPs that come with the starter decks here. I have their pairings here, along with some other little extra stuff here that we can go into. But of course we had Trunks and Ginyu release in packs on their own that you could go get, with Ginyu being one of the best MPs you could play for the first 2 sets of the game. A fun little tidbit is he mentions about allies being able to take actions, and we didn't really get a full clarification of what an action was until set 3 when Red Restriction drops, which we can talk about then. But for the first few sets of the game, we were all misplaying Guldo and Ginyu wrong. By the modern interpretation and rules of the game, you cannot use Guldo's blocking power with this level 1, but we played it anyway because that was intuitive. And there's a lot of stuff like that in this game that just is like, it seems intuitive and it doesn't make sense. So another example, we have the current errata version of this card, but let's just change the version here. The original version of this card lets you play a Dragon Ball from your life deck, and it now says place into play instead. So place into play versus play, for example, are very different effects. Playing a card means that if it has if it's a Dragon Ball, you play its effects and you use its effects when you play it. If you place into play, you don't get any effects, and so that was a really awesome thing to try to teach people. Orange Devouring Drill is another one of those cards where it cares about cards being played versus plays. Orange Escape was one of the only card outside of your planning step in which you could trigger Devouring Drill, because it was one of the only cards in set 1 that says play a drill. I think it is the only drill search or drill kind of putter into play that says play versus play. So, you had fun stuff like that. That was just awesome. Also, this card was so busted when it came out. Oh my dear God, it's still an insane card. You have a lot of these cards that say when they're rejuvenated that come out for Namekian, that some of them get errataed. Not all of them. I think the Master mainly gets errataed to where you have to rejuvenate in combat to get the anger, but on release, it was not. So you had the early knowledge decks that just played a bunch of blocks, did not play any interaction whatsoever, and could just sit there and repeatedly draw cards, play some Dragon Balls. You destroy cards off the top of your opponent's deck. If your opponent played Dragon Balls, they would destroy cards off their decks. It was just a frickin' mess, and oh my dear God, the Dragon Balls in the early game are just so devastatingly powerful. Dynamic Dragon Ball 1 is just absolutely insane in a meta where there's not a lot of critical damage effects, and then you have a whole mastery that says you can't capture Dragon Balls. The whole thing is you'd play Knowledge Mastery, and it says if you only control one Dragon Ball, it can't be captured by a critical damage effect. So now you just play Dragon Ball 1, all your Dragon Balls can't be captured, and you could literally just sit there with this one Dragon Ball out and that Mastery, and they could never cap that Dragon Ball. All of your attacks are doing extra damage, and you have a Dragon Ball on the table to be used for effects. So, of course, the Namekian style in that first set was really big about using Dragon Balls as a resource. They were the only style that had any Dragon Ball bouncing. Blue Reprimand is the only other card I can think of off the top of my head that lets you shuffle Dragon Balls and do stuff with Dragon Balls. There will be cards for other styles that come out, but the Dragon Balls are just so powerful. Dropping an opponent's MP a whole level, plus Namekian being able to loop this meant Namekian had the best anti-anger essentially in the game, on top of having the best anger in the game consistently. Dragon Ball 3 is just absolutely Fruit Loops, dropping 3 cards. Ball 4 in the metagame where there is very little good board hate. You're really at the mercy of board decks in the early couple sets of the game that get set up with these drills or setups, mostly setups. Ball 5, this card was an absolute menace, especially pre-errata Knowledge Mastery, because you played for 2 anger. and you get to draw a card. And of course, ball 6. If physical was ever going to be an archetype in the first set, this card directly kills it. Nobody really has grade 18 in this first set outside of God Goku, and having a PR extra of 3 on top of your opponent doing 2 less stages is just so crippling. Like, stage B decks just did not exist. You could play a ball 1 and a ball 6, and then now, okay, your opponent's got to take ball 1 first, and now your Knowledge Mastery, oh look, they can't take ball 6, so you're just sitting there with a ball 6 out like permanently. Oh god, I don't think there's a single card in the first set that comes out that says straight up capture a Dragon Ball. I think that's not until, I believe it's one of the first cards that actually straight up captures a Dragon Ball is going to be Face Smash in the next set. So Dragon Balls are just such a good meta option to splash in decks, especially if you're able to, if you're Knowledge Mastery, obviously, or if you're able to kind of control them with critical damage effects. Ball 7, of course, you would play this card with Knowledge Mastery to destroy 4 off your opponent's deck and put any 3 cards back from your pile. And you're already in this only style in the game that really has any recursion as is. I mean, Saiyan had some, but man, Knowledge Mastery was just a monster and playing against it. Highly synergistic. Of course, Piccolo having a level 2 that is one of the only levels and only consistent things to access for critical damage effects. Mad synergy. Like, this level 2 was the bane of my existence for many sets of the early game. It's an incredible level. It does everything you need it to. On the note of the stage beat stuff, though, of course, we had a God Goku promo gets released, and he was meta relevant to some degree the first, I'd say, 2 sets of the game. There was an argument that you could pair him with, because the level 2 at the time was the Kaioken Goku here, you could play decks that just wanted to sit on level 1 Goku, and if you ever leveled off that 1, you used the Kaioken level to go down. It allowed you to splash some drills potentially. So like one of the builds, for example, was Saiyan Empowered Mastery, and some people played him where you always gain anger in stages when you do attacks, so you're sitting there keeping your AT high with God Goku, and then you're able to draw more cards because he destroys the top of his deck, draw a card as a power. If you ever actually end up leveling because the master gives you anger, you just drop yourself down to reuse, and potentially you could play some of the drills in the early game. Really, there's only like one that you maybe would play, which is like the retaliatory drill, which if your opponent hits you, your attacks did more damage. But it was a strategy. I remember seeing a lot of meme decks of Saiyan for the first couple sets where people would just load up like as much endurance as possible, because that's kind of what Saiyan's MO was for a lot of the Panini era, is just a bunch of cards with endurance with bad effects. But that was something you could do. You could play Blue Protective Goku. So there was an argument you could play to black. Like, he was kind of the only, him and Vegeta to an extent were the only kind of viable stage beat decks, but the meta was definitely ran by Piccolo with insane synergy with Knowledge Mastery. Some people did pair Piccolo up with Devious Mastery because of cards like Scout Maneuver, Black Searching Technique come out in the very first set of the game. Piccolo's Special Beam Cannon comes out the first set of the game. So you have all these cards that are about like crippling your opponent's deck. And back then the game is so slow that you weren't really like able to really capitalize and punish people. So you could run a lot more board, and you could run a lot of these slower cards that like destroyed your opponent's deck, because there weren't really that many good cards yet that made your deck kind of run. So control was really, really powerful, which is why Krillin was very powerful. And on the note of San Diego Comic-Con promos, we have the Krillin, the infamous Krillin misprint, where he does not gain anger on this level like his starter deck counterparts. For the longest time, there was a lot of meta arguments to why this was the better level, and all the way through most of, like up and through the 6th set, Vengeance set, there was an argument that Black Krillin with this level was a competitive deck. Krillin with this level 1 meant that you could always access a critical damage effect every combat, and like I said, with the Dragon Balls existing, and then you have Ginyu, who's a competitive threat, kicking out allies that are not being played how they're supposed to be. Ginyu having access to like a bunch of different stuff he gets off the allies, and Piccolo being able to abuse the Dragon Balls so easily, like being able to threaten those with Krillin made Krillin an incredibly powerful contender. People argue whether Black Devious Krillin or Knowledge Piccolo was the better deck. There's arguments for both, and then there's people that argue Ginyu, Rainbow Ginyu was the best deck, and it all depended on what point of the meta and what cards you played and everything. But the three of them had this like really interesting metagame where, especially later on in later sets, we can talk about once the next set pops, Ginyu gets an ally that kind of makes him the Namekian killer, and Krillin kind of becomes the ally killer. And so we kind of had like that kind of thing going on where he beats him because he gets the crits early, and he has access to his name card Destructo Disc, one of the only cards that consistently can crit in the game, as well as having a level 1 is one of the only cards that consistently crits, made Krillin the best kind of counter for Ginyu. Ultimately, I think there's a big argument to say Krillin was the best one out of the 3, but Knowledge Piccolo was an absolute monster. And so if you were a pleb and you didn't go online and buy off eBay that started at Krillin, you had to use this one. But this guy had a lot of synergy. He was really strong. A really good rogue build was this level 1 with the Red Enraged Mastery, because it's a 3 anger level with how the Red Enraged Mastery reads. Red Enraged was a great mastery, it just needed the card pool to kind of develop, which it eventually does in Panini. But even in the early sets, like there was a game like I played at a local where I went like level 1 to 4 with Krillin and just like completely. It's pretty crazy. Krillin Rage was a really fun rogue deck that I want to showcase off here. So, of course, we have Empowered Vegeta, was kind of where he lived, along with Red Enraged for the longest time. Vegeta never really had any competitive showing. A lot of times, like, if your opponent got set up a board, you just couldn't match them, but if you could get to Vegeta's level 3, you could close games out. If you were on his level 2, and you floated into 3 in a combat, you could put +4/+4 and everything, and as long as your opponent doesn't block it, you could potentially gain them. So Vegeta had one of the only kind of abilities to kind of actually really one-turn kill somebody. Gohan was irrelevant, but there was some fun interactions where you went infinite. This has of course been eroded to once per turn now, but this instant power used to be a constant where essentially if you played him in Knowledge and you could get to level 4 and you triggered one use of his one use of the Mastery's constant on Knowledge, you could essentially win the game. You could gain 5 anger in an instant if you had enough cards in your pot. That was a fun one that didn't get eroded till Fancy Era, fun fact, but you know, Gohan didn't really have a competitive stack for the longest time. Goku Orange was kind of really rogue. Drills, for the majority of the lifespan of the game, did not have memory, unlike allies, which have memory, which means after you use their power, they can't be used again. If you could bounce a drill out of play, which at the time wasn't really viable in set 1. I don't think there's really any cards that get rid of your drills that come to mind for the first couple sets of the game, but there was some real power behind that. So Orange Goku having access to some really good energies out of the gate in set 1, like Orange Stare Down, Orange PowerPoint was pretty viable. Was like a definite rogue strategy that you could catch people off guard with. Frieza, not really relevant. He's kind of, in my opinion, worse Vegeta because he's reactive. Really, the meta revolved around primarily the 1, 2, and 3, and also this Piccolo level promo does not get released until like a Blu-ray release, and I can't even remember, it was still set 1 when the Blu-ray release of this came out. It might have even been like set 2 or 3 of the game, but we finally get this the big hand Piccolo. I'd like to showcase a few decks here, using some of these MPs, some maybe playing some like rogue stuff. I was thinking we're going to try to do Empowered Vegeta here, Adaptive Goku, Knowledge Piccolo, Devious Krillin, probably the Brian Valdez version that runs 7 balls, as he was a pretty prominent player back then. King probably like a Devious, maybe Adaptive Ginyu, maybe probably one of those two, and then like Enraged Krillin, because that was a really fun rogue deck. Of course, that was something that Ryan Lambden of UFC Cut on YouTube did. So just some old memories here. Of course, there's some interesting stuff about the set 1 as well, is that we have some like retrains kind of some old cards, and of course some like meme relevant cards. We have like Over 9000 was a card. Of course, this was a popular internet meme made translated to the game. Battle Positing was like one of the many retrains from the old score game that is significantly weaker than its counterpart, but you know, has its place. This is one of those neat cards that occasionally sees some really niche play. Was pretty viable, I think, especially in like Black Krillin, for example, to get discs and stuff, looping discs back, and even in Piccolo to a degree, being able to get like right throws and stuff. Devastating Blow was like super staple and will continue to be staple for a fair portion of the Panini's lifespan, and into the Fancy Era, really. It's still a very powerful card to this day. This is one of my favorite cards in the game, and of course, Dragon Ball Z Abridged being really popular, it always made me think of the I Need an Adult scene, and so that's probably part of the reason why I really loved this card. It's up there with Tug of War, which I will talk about when it's relevant. We also had Visiting the Past at this time. From all of Panini's lifespan, we have Visiting the Past, which benefits you greatly if you're the defender, but it did give you some sort of kind of quality control if you're being the aggressor, which It was just a staple in every deck. It was really, I don't think I practically ever saw decks that didn't staple this card for the majority of its lifespan. One of the little neat history facts of the game too was like the cards that they try to promote as being like reprints, and like none of them actually being viable. So there was things like Same Lightning Dodge, Blue Round Throw that they touted as being cards that you could run the Score versions of. One difference they made between Panini and Score was putting AT to indicate how you calculate damage, which is something that they did not do in the old game on the card, so they're not a 1-for-1, and so in this game it would play differently. It was something that they only really did the first set. I think they did like 2 or 3 cards in the next set here, but it was a gimmick that they abandoned really quickly because it was a joke and it was just a marketing ploy. And of course the controversy of the 2 spheres, Heroic Energy Sphere and Villainous Energy Sphere, and people were very upset that Trunks Energy Sphere got reprinted as alignment exclusive card that you had to get. That was a staple. That was an ultra rare. Of course, you know, the bidding wars happened, and these cards went from like $20 to $40 to like $100 in like a span of like a couple days. It's really interesting. They kind of set off in the first set here. The kind of the pattern. What they do is that they would every set would have like a villains only and a heroes only card as the ultra rares, and so like we have the 2 spheres. Of course, alignment restricted, and then we have Villainous Visage, which saw significant meta play. The heroes were kind of just more competitively viable for the majority of Panini's lifespan, I would argue, but did see play in any deck that could run it, anybody that pulled it. Heroic Plan did see play in Black Krillin, especially. Knowledge Piccolo was pretty viable for a long time as a way to get your Dragon Radars, your Dragon Clans. But eventually this kind of fell out of favor just because more cards got printed that were just like you wanted to slot in instead. Stared on Confro, Staples being reprinted. Time is a Warrior's Tool. Cards being changed to event type, like the GT counterparts instead of combat cards. Of course, one of my other all-time favorite cards I want to talk about is Quickness Drill. This was a great card for a lot of orange decks, especially, in my opinion. I think it was decently viable in black, given that they had discard effects, but just having some more manipulation of pile was cool. I loved this card. That's why I'm talking about it. Rage Blast was very meta. This card eventually kind of fell off once more styles got printed anger, but this was like essentially a reprinting of Captain Ginyu's Energy Attack from Score. Name cards now are restricted to only the MP, so a lot of those kind of really neat effects from staple anger cards and stuff got put onto freestyle cards, or non-styled cards rather. The card was really meta for the first couple sets of the game and then fell off eventually. We'll get into some gameplay though. I don't really think there's any other cards I personally feel that need to talk about, but there are a lot of little interesting interactions and timings. Again, like, oh, here's another card like Black Erasing Drill. You have cards with hit effects versus cards that say when successful that you have to explain to new people. Like, this game was just such a freaking mess. But some things that they did do good is they separated allies into their own card type versus having MPs and stuff, and the streamlining. There's a lot of good streamlining that they did for the game. Yeah, we'll get some games going for you guys. If there's things that you feel like I missed or you'd like to discuss in comments or anything, by all means, I hope it comes to mind and gets you going. So take it easy, guys. Peace.